Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
Next week is the second double parsha in a row. We had Tazria Matzorah today, and then next week Achrei Mod Kadoshim. And I wanted to focus on a two-verse section of Parshat Kadoshim, but mostly on the first of the two verses. And I'm going to start out by saying that people rarely like to be reprimanded. Under almost all circumstances, right? It happens so often that we still don't like it, right? I think there are people who like to present themselves as if they don't mind reprimand. And I think there are people who are good at receiving reprimand. And I think there are people who are good at giving reprimand. I'm not sure there are a whole lot of people who actually like it. I think they might find a way to stay grounded and stay humble when receiving it. But it's not an easy thing either to receive the news that you're not acting as you should be acting. And I think it's not an easy thing to tell someone that they're not acting as they should be acting. And yet, as we're going to see in a second, it happens to be, hey Tom, it happens to be a core Jewish idea, but probably not in the way it's usually done. Meaning, usually the way reprimand is done in the Jewish tradition, in like a shul community. Hi, Sean, is less than what the Torah had in mind. But let's start with it. There are more sheets up here. I'll put them on the table. 1 second. We went from no minyan to standing room only. We're gonna be turning people away at the door. Okay, so Vayikra, for those who just came in, we're starting the learning now, and then we'll pause for mincha because we didn't have a minyan to start mincha, and then we'll go back to the learning. Vayikra Yotet Pasuk Yud Zayin. I want you to read this verse. I'm going to help you with it in the Hebrew, and try to understand the pshat of the pshat, meaning without thinking wild theories, just deep in your understanding of the words, what is the main information, the main learning that this verse in the Torah is asking us to live by? Okay. For some reason, the Hebrew came out strangely in the first quote, so there's some pauses where there shouldn't be pauses. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. The word tisna means hate. Do not hate. Et achicha, your brother, your fellow. So it's masculine here, but I don't think it means specifically a brother. I think it means a fellow sojourner in your community. Bilvavecha, in your heart. Okay. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. That's phrase one. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You have a verb doubled. When a verb is doubled like that, hocheach, tocheach, like the second paragraph of the Shema, ve'aya im shemoa tishma. Sometimes you'll see it translated in Old English translation as verily, right? It's an emphasis, right? And you shall certainly hocheach your amit, right? Hocheach is related to the word tochacha, which means a rebuke or a recrimination. You might be aware that there are two parashot of the year, Parshat Bechukotai and Parshat Kitavo, where the laner reads the verses very quickly and very soft because we're reading that the God is rebuking the Israelites for all the sins they're going to do in the land of Israel. That's called the tochacha, right? From this verb, hocheach, tochiach, amitecha. Amitecha is similar to amcha. You shall verily rebuke a member of your nation, okay? And then, velo tisa alav chet. Vavs in the Torah are pluripotent. They can mean and, they can also mean but, they can also mean rather. And it's unclear if this should be translated as rebuke your fellow and kind of an implied therefore don't bear any guilt on that person's account. Or it might be understood as a but. Rebuke your fellow, but don't bear any sin on his or her account. Lo tisa alav chet. Literally, don't carry upon that person a sin. Okay, there are three sub-clauses of this verse. They may just go A, B, C. They may go A, B, semicolon, C. We don't know if the C is a doubling down of what you're not supposed to do, or is it somehow the result of doing B the wrong way? Let me ask you in the room, we should actually have a microphone going around. What do you think is the main information that should be understood from this verse? If you're speaking, speak into the mic. Who's speaking first? Who's got a thought? Everyone is put to sleep by the tuna fish. But that, okay, I'll repeat it, Sandra. Yeah.
Okay. That rebuking your fellow somehow is related to not hating your brother.
Okay, so the first thing Sandra said is, maybe this is not just a random list, maybe this is all of a theme, that somehow you might think the opposite, that rebuking someone is an expression of hate, right? If you yell at someone, in common parlance, that means that you don't have a high feeling about the person. But maybe by the Torah's linking together part A and part B of the 3-part verse, don't hate your brother. One of the ways in which you show non-hatred towards your brother is putting him or her back on the right track. Right? Don't feel so heavy about offering rebuke. It's an expression of the opposite of hate. And what is another word for articulating the opposite of hate? Love, right? Like it might even be the Torah's way of saying, how is it? Instead of saying, I don't hold hatred in my heart, and therefore I'm just not going to get involved. I'm not going to tell the person doing wrong. Since I don't have hatred in my heart for you, I need to tell you you're doing something wrong. That's my way of expressing to you that I don't hate you. If I hated you, I would let you continue in your wayward ways. But I don't hate you. Interesting possibility. What else do you tease out of this? Marshall?
At the end of the sentence, I don't know what the word alav means or to what it refers. Does it refer to the first part, lo tisna et achicha b'levavecha, or does it refer to hocheach tochiach et amitecha?
Yeah, the alav is an interesting word. It's a preposition, a male singular preposition. It seems to be related to this verb lo tisa, do not bear, something like on that person's account. That's how it's normally translated. That don't carry chait, don't carry sin because of that person. Is it because of what that person does, right? You might say, this is why some people translate it as an and, rebuke your fellow so that the person doesn't sin and you're carrying the responsibility because you could have stopped the sinning, right? Rebuke them, and therefore you're not going to be responsible for that person's sin. But it can also be understood as a but. Yes, rebuke that person, but don't let somehow the rebuke end up on your shoulders as that person's sin. And we'll look at some of the commentaries in a second. Irv or Marshall?
I saw Rabbi Tarfon saying what I agree with. I would be surprised as anyone in this generation who can receive rebuke. And
Are you jumping ahead again?
Did I do that?
Are you jumping ahead? Did I give you permission for that?
No, actually, it's beshert that I would find that, because the second best-selling book after the Bible is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this really struck me. What right in the beginning is criticism never works because the person, it doesn't work.
Right.
They don't reform. All they do is get pissed off. And so me and Rabbi Tarfon and the Bible are now in sync. Thank you, Rabbi.
We're going to get to Rabbi Tarfon in a second. At face value, it seems a common, uncomplicated obligation the Torah is putting upon us to not hold hatred in our heart for people that we love, to rebuke them if they're doing something wrong, and somehow spare ourselves from holding their sin. Michelle, can you give Michelle the microphone?
Well, I think what it's saying is that one way to not hate your brother is to rebuke them when you see them doing something wrong. Otherwise, you just carry around, you're mad and you're pissed off. But if you rebuke them, at least you vented and you've told them what you think. Correct.
There's a scene, I grew up in the 80s, and so I grew up on all the John Hughes movies. There's a scene in Breakfast Club where the character played by Ali Sheedy, right? They're all going about all the things their parents do to them, right? So the character played by Judd Hirsch, he beats them up and he burns them, whatever. And Ali Sheedy is a very odd character. And they say, what did your parents do to you, right? And they hurt you, no, they yell at you. I'm not getting the exact language. And she says in a very emotional way, they ignore me, right? As if the worst thing you could do is not to be on someone's back and tell them doing something wrong, but to evince no care whatsoever, right? If you're not rebuking, it means you have no care about what that person does or doesn't do in his or her life. Yes, Marshall?
When I said that I didn't understand the word alav, I trying to look at the way the sentence is put together, that after the word bilvavecha, there's an edach ta, which is a pausal form. But then we have "Hocheach tochir tamitecha lo tisa alav chet," which it seems to me is like a second part of the whole thing. And I thought maybe that the word alav really referred to ma'ases shel hochacha, an act of hochacha.
Mm-hmm. That in the act of giving rebuke, don't bear guilt. Yeah. So we're going to see a commentary in a bit that gets close to that. Let's look at the Talmud for a second. Was your hand up? Oh, Tom. By the time we get the microphone to you, but.
Thank you. I was going to say I have a question, but not an answer about why it's bilavav vecha. Why is it in your heart? Don't hate your brother in your heart. Well, I mean, you could have the sentence without the heart.
Correct.
And so how does that change it?
Perfect segue, as if you wrote Masechet Arachin. Now, we're looking at a piece of Talmud from Masechet Arachin. I'll tell you something very interesting. However much you all know about the Talmud, you know it's a very, 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 very long book. I did a text study this morning on Parshat Tazria Matzorah. And in putting together the text, I came across, medieval sources, Talmudic sources, and I pulled a source that happened to be from Masechet Arachin on the same side of the same page as this on totally different topics. So I will be teaching from Masechet Arachin, page 16b, twice in one day on two different parshas on two different topics. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. That's a technical term in the Talmud saying that the rabbis are invoking a source from the Tannaitic period, from the early rabbinic period, but a period that was a text that did not appear in the Mishnah. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. What does it mean to say you shall not hate your fellow in your heart? It'll be clear that they're asking the same question Tom asked. Yachol lo yakenu. Yachol is a technical term. Yachol literally means able to, but what the Talmud means yachol is, could we possibly understand this verse to mean that you are not supposed to hit the person? Lo yastirenu. Yistarenu. Or could it mean that we're not supposed to slap the person? Lo yikalkalenu. Could it mean that you're not supposed to, it's hard to translate this. Likalkel means to ruin. Some kind of like a physical ruining of the person, meaning, am I supposed to understand that the only thing that I'm adjured not to do by this verse is not to express hatred? Because you can imagine that, right? Don't express hatred to a friend. But what is it? So meaning, and how would you express hatred? By being physical, by hurting them, by being mean to them. And the Talmud says, Talmud Lomar, the verse says, Bil vavecha, in your heart. Sin'ah shebalev hakatuv medaber. The Torah is saying that, is he okay? Michelle's here, right? Yeah. No, it's fine. I just want to make sure it's okay. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm just making sure it's okay. No, let me just. Okay. So the Talmud's answer is that the word bilvavecha makes this a harsher or a more, a more stringent mitzvah. It's one thing to say, don't hit someone hatefully. All right, so I hate the person, I'm not going to act on it. No. Bilvavecha. You're not even allowed to hold hatred in your heart. It is one of the very few places in Talmudic understanding of law that you can sin without an act, right? In the same way, there are a few places where you can do a mitzvah without an act, right? V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right? Love the Lord your God. What's the act of love? Well, some people say that the rest of V'ahavta tells you the act of love is putting on tefillin. The act of love is kissing the mezuzah. But the notion of commanding a feeling is an interesting thing because it's hard to legislate a feeling. Here, it's legislating not to have a feeling. Right? Don't think of pink elephants. Don't hate your brother. Very hard to do. I would like to think that most of us, most of the time, are pretty good at not acting hatefully. Most of us fail every day in some way in the obligation to not feel hatred. Very hard to do. Okay, look at the next source, and I think after the next source we'll pause for mincha because I don't want to miss the opportunity to do mincha. This is just later on on that page. Minayin lero'eh b'chavero. By the way, this is a very Talmudic way of understanding it. They're trying to make sense of each phrase and subphrase so that nothing goes to waste, right? Every phrase meant something in determining what the law was. Minayin lero'eh b'chavero davar meguneh shechayav l'chochicho. How do we know that if you see in your friend something unseemly. It doesn't mean that they like something physical unseemly, like they're doing something or they're saying something that shouldn't be said, that you are obligated to rebuke that person. Shnei amar, from our verse. It says, Hocheach tochiach, you shall verily rebuke them. Hochicho velo kibel. Let's say I told the person, stop doing that. And they didn't listen. They didn't pay attention. Minayin sheyachzor v'yochichenu. How do I know that I'm supposed to come back and do it again? Talmud Lomar, because the verse says tochiach. If the verse had just said hocheach, rebuke your fellow, I would have said the obligation is do it once and you've absolved yourself. But because it's that word verily I used before, because it says hocheach tochiach, if I notice that Eric is doing something wrong, he never does anything wrong, and I tell him he's doing something wrong and he doesn't pay attention, I have a religious obligation to tell him at least one more time, because the Torah says to me hocheach tochiach. Don't stop at hocheach. You have to try it a second time. Mikol makol, in every situation. Yachol afilu mishtanim panav. Very interesting phrase. And I translated it directly without telling you what I think the phrase means, because I want to see if you can figure it out. Is it possible that I'm supposed to keep going and rebuking him and rebuking him and rebuking him, even though he's not receiving, until the point mishtanim panav, that his face changes? What does that mean? What do you think it means? That should I keep rebuking the person until their face changes? Don't think so. Humiliate, right? So if the doubling of hocheach tochiach means I can't get away with just telling someone they did something wrong once, but keep doing it, do I keep doing it? Do I keep doing it? If they get red in the face, if they're still not changing but they're being humiliated, this is where the end of the verse comes in. Talmud Loma, the verse tells you, lo tisa alav chet. Don't bear guilt for the way in which you rebuked him. That's different than don't bear guilt by not rebuking him. Yes, you're obligated to rebuke the person, but if in the process of rebuking the person, you become the ugly thing, you become the unseemly thing, you have switched roles, and you are the sinner.
That always happens, but also, look at the very last sentence that you wrote. Do not bear sin because of that. So it's not rebuking someone because, on a minor thing. It's a major thing you're rebuking them for,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Do not bear sin.
No, but this Talmud source is using this word sin in the other direction. It's at some point, if you rebuke so persistently and so aggressively, even though you're saying, hey, I'm doing what the Torah is telling me to do, it told me to rebuke. But if you do it in such a way that you now make the other person embarrassed, you're the sinner. You bear the sin.
I've been guilty of that so many times.
As we all have, right? Listen, human nature, society has changed a lot in 2,000 years. But human nature, not so much. We're in the middle of this Talmudic page in Masechet Arachin that's trying to make sense of each section of the verse in Parshat Kedoshim that says you're not supposed to hate your brother in your heart, and you shall rebuke that person, and you should not bear sin as a result of that person. Okay? So we got to the second source on the second paragraph on the second page, and that's where we'll pick up. Tanya, we have a Breita, we have another piece of material from the Tannaitic era. Amar Rabbi Tarfon, this is the one that Herb was saying before. Tamani ani, it's hard for me to believe. The root tama, taf mem he, means to wonder, but it's sort of like an incredulous wondering. It's hard for me to believe, I'd be surprised. Im yesh bador hazeh, if there's anyone in the entire generation, shemekabel tochacha, that receives rebuke. I don't think he's saying there's no one who actually hears it. I think he's saying there's no one who is able to receive it, right? Remember I began, for those who were here, that even people who say about themselves that they're comfortable about learning about the things they're doing wrong and they want to constantly be on a growth pattern, it's very hard to receive tochacha. Im amarlo, why would it be hard for someone to receive rebuke? Because if someone said to that person, Marlo, tol kesam mi bein einecha, tol, same root as nitilat yadayim. The word nitilat does not actually mean to wash. It means the taking of the hands. It's the drawing of the hands out of the water. In Hebrew grammar, if a root begins with a nun, sometimes the nun falls out in certain forms. So tol is the same as natal. Take out or remove the kesam. It's translated here sometimes as a splinter. It's the modern Hebrew word for a toothpick. You also might know it from an old Israeli camp song. Anyone know the word kesam? Haruach noshevet krira, nosif od kesam lamdura. A stick, like some kindling onto the bonfire. So if someone says to you, take that splinter from between your eyes, Amarlo, the person would say back to him, Tol koreh mi bein einecha. You take out the beam between your eyes. Sandra, you're laughing because you're getting the joke, but what do you think is being said here? Why does this make rebuke impossible?
Because since people can't take, they throw it back.
They throw it back, and what's the difference between a splinter and a beam? Right. You're critiquing me that I missed Tzidkatcha, right? You didn't even know it was Yom Kippur, right? It's that kind of thing, right? And if you look at Rashi down the second source, on the phrase kesam, splinter.
It makes you defensive.
Well, either because it makes you defensive, or it might be legitimate that the person rebuking you is more sinful than you, right? So it's both that it awakens. If someone is attacked, you're going to attack back, and don't throw stones in glass houses, right? Look what Rashi says on that word, on kesam, kolomar, as if to say, this is the source number 4, avon katam shebiyadecha. Someone says, I just want to critique one tiny, small, little, miniature, almost indescribably small sin that's in your hands. This one's going to say back to him, Ze omer, ze yachol amar lo, tol ata avon gadol shebiyadecha. I will take care of my small sin after you have worked on all your big sins. Which one of us would not put ourselves in the category of the second person? We always feel that we're going to be more righteous than the person who's possibly rebuking us. Hilkach, Rashi says something so interesting. Hilkach ein yicholin lehochiach shekulan chotin. He's basically saying it is impossible to do what the Torah commands us to do. It's impossible for there to be a system of rebuke because everyone sins. So on the one hand, since everyone sins, you would think, well, that everyone should be subject to rebuke. But because everyone is sinning, I'm aware that the person rebuking me is liable to rebuke. And so the whole system breaks down. Because bigger than the splinter is the beam, and bigger than the beam is something else. So Rabbi Tarfon says, this is really a beautiful verse. It's impossible to live by. Yeah.
I think one of the fascinating things about this passage are the words "B'dor hazeh." So he's saying, I can't imagine anyone in this day and age being able to give or take rebuke appropriately. And I'm asking myself, is he being humble? Like, is he saying previous generations learned, but we can't? And how is it that he's a time traveling rabbi? Because I would say that about our generation too.
I hadn't focused on the Dor Hazeh. The first time I was reading it, I was reading it as a colloquialism, as if I can't imagine anyone in this generation as a way of actually saying anyone in any generation, but it's interesting to linger on that possibility that he's saying, woe to us, that the Torah actually gave us instruction that we should be able to live by, but look around. It's impossible to do it in this generation because everyone is both sinning and thinking that everyone else is sinning more than them. But there might be a society in which this were possible. That's really interesting, Sean. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah turns it around a bit. Next phrase. Amar Rabbi Elazar, but this is the next phrase in the previous paragraph, the second paragraph, second page. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, you're surprised that nobody can take rebuke? Tamahani or tameni ani im yesh b'dor hazeh she'yodei lochiach. I'm surprised that anyone is able to give rebuke. What does it mean by that? Look at Rashi, because that can mean several different things. Does it mean that can't get the words out? Does it mean doesn't feel confident doing so? Source number 5, she'yodei lehochiach, that knows how to rebuke, derach kavod. I don't know anyone. You're blaming the person who can't receive the rebuke. I blame the rebuker. I don't know a single person who knows, according to Rashi, how to give rebuke respectfully, without viciousness, without contempt. The couples therapist John Gottman talks about all different types of relationships and all different types of marriages that can be successful. There are lots of different types, but there are certain aspects in a relationship that if it becomes present, it becomes corrosive. And he says one of them is contempt. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be upset. You're allowed to be disappointed. You're allowed to rebuke your partner. If it goes into contempt, game over. Right? Contempt is very hard to heal from in a marriage, in a friendship, and in any relationship, right? So if you're giving rebuke in such a way that the person is hearing from you not a Torah desire to make your life more holy, but a holier than thou desire that comes off as contempt, it's not your fault for not receiving it, Rabbi Elazar ben Azari says. It's their fault for not giving it in the right way. Shalo yu panav mishtanin. If you cannot critique without the person's face changing as a result of the critique, you're doing something wrong, not them, right? Steinsaltz, modern Israeli scholar, says it slightly differently. This is verse number 6 on the phrase, Tamani ani sheyesh b'dor hazeh mi sheyodeh lahochiach. What does it mean that I don't know anyone who knows how to rebuke? Kara'ui, appropriately. Rashi says b'kavod, with honor or respect. Steinsaltz tells appropriately. Below halbanat panim, without the whitening of the face. That's a phrase for embarrassment. Udvarav mitkablim. What is the proof that you've given rebuke successfully? Right, and that the person took it.
As someone who's respectfully rebuked many times, I say I appreciate what you've told me.
So if someone can say back to you without crying or being embarrassed, I'm grateful for that rebuke, that's a successful rebuke, right? Sometimes, by the way, if you're really extra menschy, you try to say that even if the person didn't rebuke you respectfully. I do that every day of my rabbinate. And we talk about that, Rabbi, like how do you receive feedback that may or may not have been given with kavod in a way that allows the situation to go forward, because you actually want to be, you actually want someone to feel like they're comfortable giving you a rebuke. I tell that to our staff and to our interns all the time. Act in a way that a person will feel that for them to give you not angry rebuke, but to give you feedback that you're hungry for it, because that sets up a healthy relationship of learning and of trust. Okay. Last little piece of that Arachin, source 7. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. These are all sages who lived around the same time in the land of Israel. Me'id ani alei shamayim. Shamayim aretz. I call upon the heavens and earth as my witnesses. I mean, there are these phrases throughout language in all generations. You know, like may God be. So where's may God be my witness? Shaharbe pamim laka Akiva al yadi. Many times Akiva, who as Rabbi Roth would say was no nachschlepper, Rabbi Akiva was a significant person. Many times he was, what does luka or laka mean? He was whipped. He was lashed on my account. Why? Shayiti kovel alav, because I critiqued him. Lifnei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. I told on him, I tattled. I told Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, your disciple Akiva is not acting the right way. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel brought him into his office. He told him what he was doing wrong. And either he was whipped because he violated a Torah law that's the punishment, or this is a way of saying that he was emasculated, or not even emasculated. He was taken to task by Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, right? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, I admit it. A lot of times Rabbi Akiva had to bear the brunt of the rebuke was because I let the master know what was going wrong. The kol shekain shehosafti bo ahava, and what I experienced, he's saying, and I swear that the heavens and the earth are my witnesses, that as a result of that, he loved me more. There was more love between us, not less. He thanked me for alerting me to the things that I was doing wrong, telling my mentor so that my mentor could share the rebuke with me, hopefully bechavod, and he made me love me more, not less. Lekayem mashin amar, to establish or to fulfill that which it says in the book of Proverbs, al tochiach latz penis sanacha, v'hocheach lachachem v'ye'avacha. Do not rebuke a scorner because they're not going to take it. Rebuke a wise person and he will love you. Right? So if you try to fulfill this mitzvah, if either side of the equation on this mitzvah is in a category of scorner, then it's going to be a scornful rebuke. The person won't hear it, or the person's not willing to hear even good rebuke. But a wise person wants it, is hungry for it. A wise person reads Parshat Kedoshim and says, God wants my fellow to tell me when I'm doing something wrong. Thank you, and I mean it, not a cynical thank you. Which leads me, I started this shiur by saying I wanted to look at 2 verses. We want to look at 1 verse. The next verse, after this one that says, don't hate your brother in your heart, but rather rebuke him. The next verse is a very famous verse. In fact, it's a verse that Akiva, whom we spoke about before, said was Klal Gadol b'Torah, a great principle in the Torah. We normally quote the second half of the verse. The whole verse is interesting. Lo tikom, don't take vengeance. That's the root nikama, the nun is gone. Lo titor, don't bear a grudge et b'nei amecha, upon the people of your community. Why? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your fellow like you love yourself. And then an interesting punctuation, ani Adonai. One of the ways in which I continue to be God in the world is by you having relationships with others, where you are open to rebuke and open to give them a rebuke. You do it b'chavod. You don't bear a grudge. You don't bear the person's sin either by not telling something they were doing something wrong or doing it so harshly that they embarrass themselves. And that if you love yourself enough to try to improve yourself, you should love your neighbor enough to have them be improved. And if you love yourself enough so as not want to embarrass yourself, then don't ever do that to a neighbor. There is a sort of platonic way in which this can happen, right? It's so rare. But the Torah is an aspirational document. The Torah is something for us to try to achieve, no matter how hard it is, because it is hard. And in that way, we all rise together.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.